My father was killed. He was 87 years old. He lived through the Nakba in 1948, where he was forcibly expelled out of his village to the northwest of the Gaza Strip. He was 12 years old then. Those bitterly painful events remain carved in his memory until the day he was killed. He used to recount to me the most detailed specifics. He never forgot the names of his neighbors or those who marched with him in their forcible exodus from his village to Jabalia refugee camp to the north of Gaza. He's been carrying those bitter moments with him. That is why he refused to relive the same vicious events. He always feared being expelled south or out of the Strip. He held his ground to the last moment and preferred to die holding on to his roots, especially since he was a history teacher who taught thousands of students throughout his career. So did my mother, who served in the education field for 35 years. They always rejected the idea of forcible expulsion by the Israeli occupation forces that took the land. They refused to succumb to pressures. They moved from home to home, refusing to leave the north. That was their destiny, and all I can say is that God is our rock. He is the disposer of all affairs. God is our refuge, and from him only we gain strength.
To Israelis, it was the War of Independence. To Palestinians, it was the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today's foreign feature is Farha, currently streaming on Netflix. So briefly, Farha is the story of a young girl whose life is totally destroyed when her village is eviscerated. The movie takes place in an unnamed village in Palestine. Although fictionalized, what happened to Farha is not that different to what happened to hundreds and thousands of Palestinians during this time, and what is currently happening to millions of Palestinians in Gaza. The film is directed by Dareen Salam. So Dareen is actually the daughter of Palestinian parents who fled Jerusalem during the Nakba, and the movie is based on the true story of a close family friend who was expelled in 1948 by Zionist militias. I watched and reviewed this film when it first came out, and I thought I would revisit it considering the current Nakba and genocide taking place in Gaza at the moment. The origins of the catastrophe actually started a lot earlier than 1948, when in 1917 a man named Lord Arthur Balfour declared Britain's desire for the establishment of a Jewish homeland and promised that Britain would do everything in its power to facilitate this objective. Now, decades later and a world war later, the establishment of this Jewish homeland resulted in the dispossession of a whole state and the continuous persecution of another group. Nakba, or the War of Independence, was triggered when a UN declaration legitimized the state of Israel, partitioning what was once British-mandated Palestine into two parts, 56% which would belong to Israel, and the remaining 44% would belong to the Palestinians. What followed this declaration was the immediate ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Arab population in order to solidify Israel's rule. Since this declaration, Israel has actually come to occupy, I believe, about 80% of the land. Farha is actually one of the few mainstream movies about the Nakba, and since its release, the Israeli government has really gone out of its way to censor the film and even threaten consequences for its release. And this is pretty much in line with their policy of censoring, destroying, vandalizing, and erasing Palestinian art in order to demoralize them. What's interesting about the Nakba is for a long time, the Israeli government did its best to prevent sort of general knowledge of the Nakba from spreading worldwide. And now with the current genocide in Gaza, it's now basically used the Nakba as a threat for what will happen to you if you dare stand against Israel. I've divided my video into 3 parts, so if you want to see where this is going, just click on the description box down below. So we will start with Farha before the war. So the entire movie is told through this young girl's eyes. So Farha, right from the beginning of the film, we see that she's an ambitious young girl. She has dreams of pursuing her education and helping out her family and her community. From what little we see of this village before the war, it's very much a place inhabited by people It's full of life, it's full of greenery, it's full of resources. It's very much a place rooted in tradition and faith. Before the war or the Nakba begins in this village, the movie takes some time to basically build Farha's relationship with her father. Despite her father's reservations, he does agree to allow Farha to continue her education, and although this took place in 1948, it does really represent sort of how much Palestinians really value their education. And one of the sort of great travesties of the occupation is how it's limited human development by either making it incredibly difficult for Palestinians to receive a high quality education, or by the way the occupation just keeps killing them. So unfortunately for Israel, a good Palestinian is a dead Palestinian. So education is very important because in the last few decades, especially through social media, Palestinians have been able to voice and kind of show people their point of view, which of course has been a nightmare for the Israeli government. And this is very much reflected in what we see today, right? The number of schools, the number of universities, the number of highly educated people from Gaza and Palestine being killed, whether it be doctors, lawyers, basically people who very much could carve out a path for independence are being wiped off the face of the planet. Farha's curiosity and her passion to continue her education is very much representative of how Palestinians have been able to succeed despite their very, very difficult circumstances. Prior to the declaration of the Israeli state, Palestine was known as British Mandated Palestine. This was a geopolitical entity that existed between 1920 to 1948. The movie takes place during a transitionary period. So if you notice at the start of the movie, you see British soldiers, and at the end, you see the newly formed occupational forces. Many of the draconian policies that Israelis sort of inflict on Palestinians, they unfortunately inherited from the British, and the main one being to really subject Palestinians not to civil law, but to military law, which means whether you're a man, woman, or child, you are seen as a combatant. And I think that the Israeli occupation has actually done a very great job of kind of blurring the line between civilians and combatants. In the movie, you see that these young kids basically have no respect for the British and they're constantly throwing rocks at them. So after the Israelis took over, confrontations between Palestinians and Israelis, of course, erupted, and rock throwing has actually been a symbol of their resistance, so much so that Israel actually is one of the only countries that actually has a juvenile military court and will send children to prison for 20 years for throwing a rock at anyone wearing a uniform. And the severity of these consequences is what allows the Israeli government to kind of abuse them at will. So in the movie, you see that these children are referred to as armed combatants. And Farha's father is really confused. He's like, wait a minute, we don't have arms. We have a handful of rusty guns. Like, what are you people talking about? So these types of lies and exaggerations have unfortunately made it very easy for the Israeli government, again, to continue to blur those lines, but also kill indiscriminately, target civilian infrastructure, and pretty much make it impossible for Palestinians to defend themselves. So because the movie is told from Farha's perspective, you can see that she's not entirely sure why there's so much tension in her village, why her father is so worried, what's really bothering him. So she spends much of her time kind of daydreaming about her future, talking to her best friend. And I think her father's willingness to actually allow her to continue her education probably had something to do with the fact that he never imagined he'd be permanently expelled, let alone killed, in his own home. Before the catastrophe occurs, Farha overhears a number of conversations, the most unsettling being when a group of soldiers basically tell her father that no one is coming to save them. They don't leave. What happened to other villages will surely happen to theirs. Heartbreaking is how her father truly believed that Arab forces would come, and unfortunately this is a cruel reality. Many Arab nations have unfortunately long abandoned the Palestinian cause in favor of self-preservation and normalizing ties with Israel. right? So in recent times, you see a lot of Arab nations willing to open up trade deals, establish Israeli embassies, despite the consequences for the Palestinian people. So the war starts in probably the worst way ever. So Farha is talking to her friend about how worried she is for her father, how she's also excited to basically start this new life. And while she's talking about her hopes and dreams, they are literally cut off by the sound of bombs, and they have to kind of run back and see what's happening in the village. During the war, you hear these announcements basically telling people to flee for their lives, to basically take a number of safe passages. And as we've seen, the Israeli occupation likes to shoot first and warn later. And these announcements and these kind of fake efforts to make it seem like they're doing everything, humanly possible to limit civilian casualties has always been a lie, right? There's no safe space. So as these announcements are going on, you can see people getting shot at, you see people running left and right, because again, nowhere is safe in Palestine if you are a Palestinian. This practice of shooting before you warn, of course, continues today. So instead of announcements, they often drop leaflets telling Palestinians where to flee, or they basically tell them to scan these QR codes that, of course, they can't access because they don't have internet and they cannot charge their phones. And again, it's largely performative. It's for the outside world to think, okay, they're doing everything they can to protect civilians. And of course, this is just a lie. The idea that you can kind of bomb civilians in a surgical and precise way it just doesn't make any sense unless your target are the civilians. Like, lead up to the Nakba in the movie is really just unsettling and terrifying. Again, there's no blueprint for genocide, right? There's no textbook for dummies. It seems like her father was warned. It seems like he was very much aware of all the horrors happening in other villages. And even though soldiers actually came to his house to warn them, still he was not deterred, and still he did not flee. So of course, with that being said, the only thing left is to actually commit the genocide. The brutality of the Nakba is actually very well documented, and it's pretty much an open secret in Israel. And actually, if you have time, I strongly recommend you watch the documentary Tantura. The documentary investigates the genocide in the Palestinian village of Tantura, a wealthy area that was pillaged and destroyed during the Nakba. He visits a master's thesis by the name of Teddy Katz, who actually had to rescind his thesis, and during his research he actually interviewed a number of soldiers who basically admitted to killing, torturing, maiming, like whatever you could think of to Palestinians. And one of the points that is made in the documentary is that Palestinians were not actually able to flee all that easily despite all these safe zones, right? Oftentimes they were rounded up and just brutalized and discarded. I thought what was crazy about that documentary is Teddy Katz, like, he received a number of death threats, not because Israelis thought he was lying, but because they couldn't believe that he was exposing them like this, right? This is very much something that the Israeli government has really gone out of its way to hide. So the Nakba, or the sort of burying of the Nakba, is crucial to this idea of the war of independence, because a war really implies, especially a war of independence, really implies that you were being freed from someone, not that you were the person that other people needed freeing from. Listening to the audio of these soldiers basically just chilling and describing all the horrors they had committed, it's very clear that the Israeli government very early on, like, their target has never really been militias or resistance movements. It has always been the Palestinian people, because the more of them there are, the less legitimate their state seems. In the movie, when the genocide starts, Farha is just about to escape to the city with her friends, and then she sees her dad distraught and alone, and she decides to basically stay by his side. And while she's with him, she repeatedly keeps asking him, like, where will we go now? Where will we go now? And overnight, through this UN declaration, they were made to be foreigners in their own land, like just like that. Try and save his daughter, Farha's father basically locks her in a pantry and gives her a knife, promising her that, he's coming back. And of course, that is the last time they ever saw each other again. While in the pantry, she hears and sees a number of unthinkable horrors. The movie spends a lot of time with Farha stuck in the pantry, and so the longer she's in there, you can kind of see her hope fade. And on a second watch, I actually felt the movie did an excellent job of, it has a lot of just subtle references to basically explain how her spirit was deteriorating while being stuck in this room. At the start, Farha appears to have some hope, like she's terrified, but she really believes her father is coming back. And so she has enough food at the beginning, right? You see her eating olives. Of course, olives have been a symbol for Palestinian sort of connection to their land, to their resources, right? Like, as hard as the Israeli government tries, they can't get rid of them. As the situation deteriorates while she's in this pantry, you see that she barely has enough water, right? She's really relying on raindrops to keep her hydrated. Extreme, but actually one of the tactics that Israelis use to push Palestinians off their land is to starve them and to dehydrate them, or at least severely limit resources to make life as uncomfortable as humanly possible. During her stay in the pantry, there is a slight sort of moment of hope. She sees a family escaping to her home. Despite the difficult situation, the woman was actually able to give birth. And so Farha literally witnesses the birth of a new life, which makes her happy, which gives her, some hope that she might be able to escape this pantry. But of course, this hope for a better future is quickly dashed when the newly formed occupational forces enter Farha's home uninvited, of course. So this habit of actually coming into homes uninvited is very common by the Israeli occupational forces. They have basically stripped Palestinians of any right to privacy under the guise of security and protecting themselves. And of course, this tactic is to let them know who's in charge, scare and harass them, and basically it's supposed to be a deterrent to prevent anyone from actually standing up to them. Newly formed occupational forces enter the home, and there's a lot of subtle references here, but again, on a second watch, this movie does a really great job of unpacking how a lot of the things that happened in the past are connected to the things happening now. So you notice in the film, the occupational forces are a mix of men and women, and they're basically going around the house in search of weapons, right? They're so convinced that there's weapons of mass destruction in the civilian home. But unfortunately, all they can find is this family, right? This woman and her children. And so they just end up harassing them, right? Trying as hard as they can to trigger a reaction, which they do. Despite searching this house up and down, they don't really find any evidence of these weapons that they're looking for. But they decide to line up this family anyways and just shoot them. And before shooting them, again, the attention to detail in this film, I missed it the first time, but the second time, you'll notice that the soldier grabs earrings. And this was very common. So before killing them, they would often just raid and steal. And this is a practice that's still happening today, especially in the West Bank. So in the West Bank, they actually do raid their homes, and they don't just destroy the homes. They end up taking their possessions, and they end up bragging about it on social media. Like, it's the craziest thing that you will ever see. And the reason for that is they don't really have any fear of consequences, right? Like, they can destroy shops, steal jewelry, and international law doesn't really apply to them. So this scene of this family being murdered is actually really important because it really symbolizes the main method that Israel uses to keep its control, which is through collective punishment, right? The idea that one person is responsible for the actions of the whole family. For example, it's very common for Palestinians to be evicted from their homes if someone in their family is sent to jail, regardless of whether or not they're actually charged with a crime. It's quite draconian. It's one of the biggest lies of the Israeli War of Independence is this idea that Palestinians just voluntarily left their villages, right? They just left. They totally agreed to all of this. But of course, this is not true at all. And if you watch the documentary, there are a number of soldiers who basically admit to digging mass graves. And the decision to kill this family, again, speaks to this broader issue, like the disproportionate use of sort of force they constantly use against the Palestinian people, and the way that they're able to justify this disproportionate use, right? And again, it really lies in blurring the line between civilians and combatants. One of the scariest moments actually during this murder is when her uncle is pleading to the occupational forces, like, please, like, why are you killing women and children? Like, kill the men. Like, why are you going after them? And he's throwing up. He almost can't believe his eyes, right? It's something that just defies logic. And again, this has to do with the fact that when you're trying to establish a new state, you need to get rid of the people that were there. And so again, their target was never militias or soldiers. It has always been to depopulate the people of Palestine. Before leaving this home, the commander of the occupational forces commands one of his soldiers to kill a baby. And you see the soldier crying like he really can't do it. So instead of shooting the baby, he places a cloth over the baby and runs away. And of course, this has become a symbol of the occupational forces, which is killing babies. The most sort of difficult challenges that Israel has had is, again, depopulating the people of Palestine, right? They keep having kids, they keep growing, and they have actually taken a number of measures to try and discourage Palestinians from having children, cutting off benefits, cutting off basically anything that would make it easy or economically viable to have children, but this has not actually deterred the Palestinian people. And the other issue that they have is that there are people that are still alive that have lived through the Nakba that totally contradict this sort of fairy tale story of the War of Independence. Till this family, this baby, is on the verge of death, any hope that Farha has is pretty much destroyed, right? She's stuck in this pantry. At this point, she has lost all hope, right? She's totally just defeated. She finally gets out. She enters a brand new world. And actually, the color scheme in the movie really helps with this, right? In the beginning, it was vibrant. There was a lot of greenery, there's a lot of life. But towards the end, there's nothing, right? It's just very depressing, very dark. There's no water, right? She's trying to get some water, but of course, all the resources have been cut off. And just as she's leaving, she can see the bodies of the family that was just killed, wrapped and hidden. Again, that's the other thing. They claim that people just disappeared, but they didn't, right? Oftentimes, they killed these families, and they buried them in these mass graves and just lied to everyone and said nothing happened. So during her time in the pantry, her childhood ended, right? That was the end. She was forced to grow up. And this is a common theme, right? Palestinian children are not treated as children in the occupation, right? They're subject to military law, they're not given sufficient resources. And they experience a lot of horror that the average adult could not experience, right? The number of wars, the number of conflicts, it's really more than anyone can imagine. So Farha's only solace towards the end of the movie is this letter from her friend. And the movie ends with her kind of walking off as the sun is setting. So the sun hasn't completely set. And this is because her survival is a success. Right, as hard as they try to kill everyone, still she lives on. And more importantly, she lives on to tell the story. At the end credits note that Farha made it all the way to Syria, and she spent her whole life basically educating people of what happened to her and really telling her story so that people don't forget. So following the Nakba, the Israeli government actually invested in a heavy propaganda campaign, basically making it seem like Palestinians voluntarily left their villages. So you would see news crews, movie studios, basically shooting Palestinians just like peacefully leaving, and the Israeli army basically taking over these villages that seemed empty, seemed uninhabited. And again, that was to make it seem like this two-state solution was perfect, right? Like everybody agreed and everyone could not be happier. In addition to these propaganda campaigns, they have gone out of their way to erase all traces of Palestinian history, whether that be destroying monuments, whether that be literally renaming streets and entire villages. As hard as they try, these Palestinians will not disappear. I mean, they really want them to disappear, but it's just not working. At its core, Farha is a movie about memory, not just individual memory, but collective memory, and it's not so much about who gets to remember, but like who is allowed to be remembered. And since the Nakba, there are no memorials. There's just really nothing to pay respects to the people who died. And since the Nakba, any Palestinian who has fled the country has never been allowed back in. The Nakba essentially was the start of not just a physical occupation, but an emotional, a psychological sort of torture. And since this catastrophe, Palestinians have really been fighting to survive, right? To really hold on to their own history, because the Israeli government has gone out of its way to try and delete it. The idea that Israel has been a functioning democracy for 75 years is just like a total joke. So their foreign policy is pretty much rooted in triggering Palestinians, torturing, displacing them, and making it incredibly difficult for them to justify defending themselves. And actually, not long ago, Benjamin Netanyahu held up a map of what he called the New Middle East, and he made no mention of Palestine whatsoever. He actually noted that although Palestinians could greatly benefit from a broader peace, and that they should very much be part of the process, they should not have veto power, or essentially any decision-making power over what happens in their homeland. Much of the violence that we see is very much rooted in this occupation, like this idea that Israel has the right to defend itself, honestly not against people that it's actively occupying, abusing, and torturing into submission. Israel has actually really gone out of its way to paint itself and the occupational forces as the good guy, right? As the most moral army in the world. However, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN, and pretty much every reputable human rights agency all agree that they're absolutely not. At the moment, I believe that Israel is averaging killing one child every 6 to 10 minutes, like something crazy like that. And for those of you wondering, well, why should I care? What does this have to do with me? Well, I will tell you. So people often wonder like how the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide or what happened in Bosnia, like how do these things happen? And I feel like it's very much rooted in the fact that humans are designed for self-preservation. Like when something horrible is happening, we naturally want to distance ourselves from it, right? Like, especially from a Western perspective, like these things are happening over there, right? Like, I don't know these people. This would never happen here, where I live, in my suburb, where I'm safe. But what a lot of people fail to understand, happens in one part of the world affects all parts of the world. And so if someone can basically inflict such horrors on one group of people, what's stopping somebody else from inflicting the same level or even more violence on another group of people? This is not a process that happens overnight, right? First, you're dehumanized. Slowly, your rights are stripped away from you. And next thing you know, you're being bombed. So with that being said, I leave you with these final words. Speak the truth and shame the devil. And so I think the best thing we can do is shatter the status quo by making your point clear, right? By making your position very clear and preventing Israel's sort of hope of finalizing the depopulation and extermination of the Palestinian people. And to be clear, it's free Palestine until Palestine is free. So let me know what you think in the description box down below, and I'll catch you all later.